G'day everyone and welcome to EnQueer, Sydney Queer Writers Festival. I'm Benjamin Law and I'm so pleased to be joining you here on Ghanaland, Adelaide, where I'm currently in quarantine, but that's another story for another time. First Nations people on this continent have been sharing stories and knowledge here for tens of thousands of years, and combined they constitute the oldest continuing human civilization the planet has ever seen. And I am very grateful to elders past and present that we can continue sharing stories and knowledge here on what is and what will always be Aboriginal land. This session is called The Queer and the Writer, which I know sounds like some frustratingly obtuse European art house cinema that I would absolutely watch, to be honest. But this session is all about really digging into the heart of kind of why this festival exists and what it's really about. What constitutes queer writing? Who are the people that are the engine behind it? And is it about the writing or more about the writer when it comes to queer writing? Do writers embrace the label, or do we want to resist being pigeonholed, perhaps? So what is queer writing? This panel is about exploring the tension in being a writer who is queer versus a writer who's involved in queer writing. So we're going to be talking about questions like, does the label limit opportunities, or does it forge community? And can non-queer writers write queer characters if we want more queer representation? It's a bit of a Pandora's box, but I'm so pleased to be opening it up with our wonderful panelists. Our first guest's debut novel, Cherry Beach, was published by Text in 2020. It won the UTS Glenda Adams Award for New Writing and was shortlisted for the Christina Stead Prize for Fiction. Her second novel, Little Plum, comes out in February 2023, and she's working on a new book, Blue, a novella about bisexuality and infidelity. Laura McPhee-Browne, welcome to EnQueer.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks so much for having me. So special to be here.
Stoked you could join us. Our next guest is a performance poet, writer, and CEO of Express Media in Melbourne, an organisation that's very close to my heart. He's former director of the National Young Writers Festival and was crowned an Australian Poetry Slam champion at the Sydney Opera House, and has toured his poetry nationally at TEDx Perth and Byron Bay Writers Festival and beyond internationally across festivals in Asia. Jesse Oliver, welcome to EnQueer.
Hey Ben, thanks for having me. Looking forward to today.
You could join us. Our next guest is a Filipino editor, writer, speaker, content producer, and social media whiz from Doonside on Darugland. His works appeared in Queer Stories, SBS Voices, the ABC, Netflix ANZ, and he's also part of the iconic Sweatshop Collective in Western Sydney, through which his debut poetry collection, Down from Doonside Station, was published in 2019. G'day, Mark Mariano.
Hi, so glad to be here.
Stoked you could join us. And last but not least, our final guest is a queer non-binary writer, poet, and scholar living on Wurundjeri land. Their work is featured in Archer, Junkie, Meanjin, Overland, Pedestrian, oh my gosh, I could go on, The Age, The Guardian. And of course, their poems have appeared in Cordite and Going Down Swinging. They have lectured in philosophy at Deakin University and have taught literary theory at Swinburne. Joshua Badge, so good to see you.
Hello, friends. So excited to be here.
So happy to have collected all of our queer Pokemon, and then we can begin and cast a spell. I think this is how it works. Hey, everyone, before I talk about queer writing, I want to go back and talk about all of us as queer readers, because of course that's really where it begins for a lot of us, right? So I want to ask each of you, and maybe start with Laura, looking back, what are your earliest memories of work that were either explicitly queer or coded queer that would go on to really capture you and influence you as a writer?
Yeah. So I've been thinking about this, reflecting on this, and I think for me, I always read a lot, and I just loved reading about girls and women. I didn't really want to read about boys or men. And I remember I was talking to my mum when I was in maybe my early teens about a girl at school, and I think it would have been quite obvious to her that I had a crush on this girl. And anyway, I on it. After that, a book turned up in our house that I hadn't seen before, and it was called Anatomy on My Mind by Nancy Garden, and it's a book about two girls in New York, and they kind of fall in love, and really an amazing, clear young adult book. So that was cool with that, and I just love that her name is Nancy as well. Very good. That's kind of how I read Jeanette Winterson when I was in my late teens, I think. Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, which is a really incredible book as well about a young girl who is lesbian. But yeah, I was always looking for more from, the friendships and the books I would read, and the between young women. I always was wondering, is there more there? And I'm sure a lot of the time those authors were, it's complicated, so there probably were things going on between the lines in a lot of books that I read. Yeah.
And Laura, looking back now, do you see a line between what you were reading and what compelled you to be a writer? It's one thing to really read a book that captures you, but it's another thing to want to write it. Do you see a relationship between the two?
Yeah. Well, I think just for me, because reading was such an important part of my life, it's how I learnt so many things, and it was my hobby. It was what I did just to get away from, boring real life. So I didn't start writing till I was 29, nearly 30. And I think I just wanted to see if I could write a book, because books were just so important to me. And I knew how important they would be to so many other people. And wishing that there were more queer women in the books that I'd read growing up, explicitly queer, but also explicitly, but also in a normal way. It's just a thing that is happening, not sort of such a big deal, if that's possible. So yeah. I don't think that answers the question, but yeah.
No, it absolutely does. And I love that we're digging into the nuances of all of this as well. Jessie, I want to turn it to you. I wonder the extent to which you might have felt like an outsider growing up, and the extent to which queer writing that you encountered was a lifeline. And if so, what were those works?
No, I was, similar to Laura. I was just, I felt quite isolated in my identity. So I think I did turn to books to sort of unpack that a little bit. And I just have this distinct memory of going to this one bookstore in Perth and looking at the back, right at the back, tucked away in this tiny little section of 2 or 3 books, finding my first queer fiction piece that I read. And it meant the world to me to find that. And this is pre-internet, so we didn't have the access to these things that we do now, and it was absolutely a lifeline. And it wasn't enough after I had read it. I had to keep finding more and more stuff, which was quite difficult. But I think in the end, that's what drove me to want to sort of start writing the stuff that wasn't there for me to read. I had to write in order to continue to unpack that part of myself. Yeah.
I imagine that resonates with a lot of queer readers and writers, where it's the stuff we're reading kind of resonates only so much, and then you kind of have to do the rest of the work. At the same time, what do you remember kind of what you were reading? If you look back and think, oh, that was the kind of coming of age Jessie syllabus, what was on it?
Well, I didn't know I was trans yet, so that's the first part of it. So I was, like Laura, looking for WLW sort of content. I just knew I was different. I didn't know what all of my various aspects of my identity meant. So I was just looking for, I guess, clues about gender and sexuality and all of the stuff that they don't or they didn't at the time want to teach you or let you have access to. So any parts of those puzzles formed what I was looking for, I guess.
Yeah, thank you so much. Mark, I want to switch it over to you. Paint us a picture of the kind of young person you were growing up, and what were the texts, whether it was books, television, or otherwise, that kind of helped you find who you were?
Well, yeah, I'm very grateful, and I'm glad that Jesse touched on this aspect of internet, because I very much bloomed when social media bloomed. You know, I was around when Instagram, Snapchat, Tumblr, all that jazz, it sort of came to fruition. And for me, it was truly a mix. One of my favorite sort of book series growing up was Twilight, and it isn't canonically queer, but it feels queer. Jacob was very much one of many aspects of my sexual awakening. Um, and then, there were shows like Glee that were, little cringy now, but if you look back, they were doing some great things for the queer community. And then from there, it turned to things like fan fiction, and then I just started developing more of like a TV guide for myself. So it was a wild ride. It was definitely a wild ride growing up, and I'm glad that it's taken me to where I am now.
Looking back, Mark, like to what extent was the fact that you were engaging in work like online stuff, social media, fan fiction, which is almost like an invitation to create work in and of itself. It's not like a book you pull off a bookshelf and it's like, oh, well, I'm just the reader. Fan fiction being online kind of requires people to engage. Like, do you think those were the stepping stones towards you becoming a writer, that they happened kind of at the same time?
Oh, 100%. And I think, those spaces, whether it be Tumblr, text posts, and all that jazz, I think that was my first introduction to an online writing community. The spaces weren't available then at the time. That could be a mixture of, where I'm from and my age. But being online really, truly empowered and mobilized, my relationship with my writing. So I'm so grateful for it.
Mm. Joshua, I want to ask you, like, if we could go into a time machine and meet a younger Joshua, what did they need in terms of like queer writing, and what did they get?
What did they need and what did they get? Yeah, I suppose kind of like everyone else just described, what they needed was to see or to read people like them, which was not very easy in my tiny country town of 800 people, both because, the local public library didn't stock the kind of books that I really wanted to read. And even if they did, I would have had a hard time going about reading them at home, especially in my early teen years. In terms of what I got, I think I was trying to think really hard about this. What was the earliest like queer character that I read? And it was probably one of the very late Vampire Chronicle books, and it's a very silly plot, but they kind of retcon the vampire Lestat as being potentially bisexual, and just reading that idea in print that this very famous character might at some point have had or might have sex with another man was just, a revelation for 12 or 13-year-old me. But it probably wasn't until a little bit later that I started to actually read queer writing, possibly even not until university, because that was just the kind of the conditions that I grew up in. And then, it was people like Jeanette Winterson, particularly. I think Yukio Mishima was another kind of light bulb moment. Spring Snow and the Sea of Fertility tetralogy, which is not explicitly queer, but very, it feels queer. Forbidden Colors, James Baldwin, Hollinghurst, this kind of canon of just extremely beautiful and literary queer drama that kind of demonstrated to me by then in my mid-20s that our lives could be literary, were worth writing about. So I guess
I'm hearing
that's
some
all
real.
Yeah, that's all to
Sorry,
say.
I
guess what I needed in the end was just to have affirmed for me that our lives are valuable.
I'm loving hearing these themes that are crossing over as well. It's like texts that aren't necessarily explicitly queer, but coded queer. Jeanette Winterson and vampires, which I think is, really covers the lot. Hey, Josh, before we move on, can I ask you, maybe this is a big philosophical question that's difficult to unravel, but what made you want to be a writer?
Yeah, I think, this is, I feel as if all writers get asked this question. It's a pretty fundamental question, why write? I think that and there's a number of different answers to this. I think on one level, for me, it's just a compulsion, and I kind of think about it in that way. It's just, if I don't write for a period of time, like a week or 2 weeks or a month, like I feel itchy all over, and I just need to sit down and write. It's just kind of like a physical urge that I need to fulfill. And I think that, in some ways, this is a consequence of the particular queer experience of growing up very lonely and very isolated. When you don't have other people around you, you need to sustain yourself by creating your own worlds and reading into your own worlds. There's also, the kind of political urge to write yourself into a literary canon, that you can create the characters that other people might need now in this moment. And I also, speaking perfectly honestly, think that there, is an element of power to it. Over the page, the writer is kind of an Old Testament God who can create and destroy, and that feeling and that power, is in a sense, I don't want to say addictive, but it certainly makes the experience of writing enjoyable in a very particular way.
Well, you were really tapping into 12 years of Christian education that I went through by summoning the Bible, Joshua. Thank you very much. Slightly triggering, but I do want to talk about all of your work in relation to who you are and your sense of queerness as well, like these kind of sometimes tricky notions of authenticity and authority. And I think it's handy with this panel because you traverse so many different genres across your work, between poetry, fiction, non-fiction, polemics, and working in the social media space. And I want to start with you, Laura. You specialize in fiction, especially novels. And for you, how important is it, if it is important at all, to have that lived experience, that sense of authority in queerness when it comes to authors representing and writing queerness? I think that for many people, there are different lines between notions of staying in your own lane, avoiding cultural appropriation, but at the same time, the novelist's responsibility, of course, is to extend your imagination and to represent a diversity of human experience. Do you find yourself wrestling with these kinds of issues in your own work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I identify as bisexual, and before I wrote Cherry Beach, I'd already been drawn to write lesbian characters. So not bisexual, just women who love other women. And I started writing Cherry Beach, and the protagonist is gay. She's a gay woman, and it wasn't like a clear decision at the time. It just sort of happened like that. And even though I did want to, I've always wanted, since I've wanted to have queer characters in what I'm writing, because I just feel like that's so important. But this character just came about, and she was gay. And yeah, as I went along and I started to realize, this could actually be a book, I did have to step back and think a bit about, what's the ethics of me writing this as a woman who hasn't gone through these experiences of being a lesbian. I'm not sure. For me, I identify as queer, and what I always want to do is, it's interesting, but I always want to tell people when I'm talking about Cherry Beach and this kind of stuff, is that my mum is gay, and my mum's always been gay, like since she, I mean, obviously, but since she was little, she's been attracted to and loved women. And so, you know, if I think about it, I really think that I've spent a lot of my life thinking about my mum, you know, what it would have been like for her growing up. And she's told me what it was like. And actually, she still carries a lot of shame and a lot of complicated, you know, thoughts and feelings about her identity, which is just her reality. It's not something she wants to carry around, but she grew up in the 50s in a Catholic family. She went to boarding school, and, you know, that's just what happens when you're attracted to other girls and you're being told that that's wrong, and goes against God. And yeah, so anyway, it's I think it is quite personal because, you know, I don't identify as, I'm not a lesbian, but I feel that, you know, because of my own attraction to women and you know, understanding that fear, that those things that can happen when you're grappling with that when you're younger, but also my mum, you know, having that experience as well, has meant that I think that I was able to write a lesbian character in a way that could resonate with lesbian women. But yeah, it's just so tricky. I think an important thing is, you know, writers, yes, we write alone, but I don't think that a novel or an important piece of writing should be one person's private thing that no one else reads, no one else gives an opinion on. You know, you can't sort of just make these decisions on your own. So it's important to talk to people about what you're doing. If you're wondering about whether it's ethical, ask people that you trust and tell them the honest truth about why you're doing it and see what they think. And yeah, I guess that's, yeah.
I like the idea of, because, you know, a novelist's task is so private and solo at the end of the day. It's not like, say, television writing where you're in a room. So it's really that singular voice. And at the same time, I love that you're breaking it open and saying, well, we'll start a conversation, you know, like get people's opinions. Cherry Beach is such an acclaimed and beloved novel since its release, and award-winning as well. And I wonder, you know, that's the critical response, but what has the queer response been to the novel? Like, have there been kind of memorable conversations with queer readers and the queer community upon its release that's really struck you?
Yes, it's been incredible. I've had, like, social media is so cool because readers can reach out to you, and I've just had so many gay women reach out to me. Like, for a while, it was almost daily. It was just incredible, like saying, this has just been so cool. I've loved this book. Thank you for writing it. It's just been so cool. And actually, a lot of gay men as well have reached out to me about it. And yeah, so it's just like so cool. Yeah, that's been really, yeah, really cool.
I love it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Laura. Hey, Jessie, can I turn the conversation to you? Because when it comes to these conversations about engagement, authenticity, authority, who gets to write what, it strikes me that these conversations must be compounded when it comes to not just queer writing more broadly, but when it comes to trans participation, trans stories, getting trans narratives out there, because there's such a history of, you know, theft and mockery and appropriation. And you're also in a role of Express Media where it's really about fostering new voices as well. So where have these kind of conversations gone for you in your own work, but also when it comes to bringing other people's work up?
Yeah, it's something that I'm constantly exploring all the time, because, you know, there's definitely, like you said, on one side there's the artist side of it, but then there's also the community facilitator side of it as well. And I guess as an artist, you have this idea of not wanting to be tokenized as or pigeonholed as that type of writer, as a trans writer or a queer writer. So, like, when I did the Australian Poetry Slam, which is essentially a writing competition that's judged by people in front of you, I didn't want to have any votes that weren't associated with the work that I was producing. So I didn't want anyone to know that I was queer or trans or any of that. I wasn't out. The worst thing that I think is to not receive any criticism about my work. I didn't want to win as a trans writer or a queer writer. And when I did, I think there was a couple of like media that wanted to promote it as like first transgender writer wins. It felt really icky to me. So I asked them not to. And it was when I went on tour as an artist that I started to realize now I didn't want people to know my identities before because I didn't want it to affect their opinion of my work. But I also acknowledge that representation is important, and I want people to know that I can be a good writer regardless of whether I'm trans or queer or anything else. So I was more comfortable with talking about it. As soon as that happened, the content or the caliber of the panels that I was suddenly invited to changed like that. So it was no longer about poetry. It was about come to this festival and talk about gender. Come to this festival and talk about being queer. I had never explored those things explicitly in my work before, but that's what I was now invited to be an authority to speak on. It was very, very jarring. And I think I've had this conversation with community a couple of times. In fact, at the National Young Writers Festival, we had a closed event where it wasn't public, but it was just basically, let's get a bunch of queer people and trans people in a room and talk about this in the literary community. And the biggest thing that came up was like, if we're being offered these opportunities as queer writers, do we take them? I think the answer that came up was like, yeah, like, we need the money. Let's do a panel talking about X, Y, Z. But the converse of that is that, what does that do to our work? If I'm only now being invited to share things about gender or about sexuality, all of my poetry has to address that now. I can't continue to appear on these panels without my work exploring that in some way. And so it completely shifted the caliber or the content of my work. And that goes back to the original content of my work being similar to what I think Josh does, is like political sort of, the overarching structures. I was never at odds with my sexuality. That wasn't the struggle. My struggle was with why we're in the position we are within society. That was the caliber of my work, and that's what I wanted to explore. But that's not what I was invited to talk about. I was invited to talk about my struggle with my sexuality. They're very different things. So that's my experience as an artist. But now as a community leader, I definitely take that with me, and that's something that I'm so passionate about in what I do with Express Media, and particularly working with young writers. I know, here's a crazy stat with National Young Writers Festival, 70% of the people who apply identify as LGBTI. So that's a huge proportion of young writers that identify as queer. And they all understand the struggle that I was describing before about being a queer writer. They're all struggling with, to what degree do we explore that in our work? So I think I'm very conscious when I do program any events or create opportunities for the community. I think it just comes from being a queer artist, understanding that I'm not going to produce a panel of a bunch of young writers to talk about being gay.
It's a really important conversation to crack open, right? And it's almost like a meta conversation about this panel right now. But, it's about that tension about how these two things have to be simultaneously true. Like, none of us want to be pigeonholed. At the same time, we also want to forge community and see the power in that. But, they're on parallel tracks. I note in your bio, Jesse, that you write, Jesse hardly writes about identity, or does he? I just thought that was great, because there's a question, right? Have you arrived at an answer, do you think? And I mean, like, to what extent is that a lovely provocation just to throw out there too?
I don't know. As soon as I wrote that, I was like, why did you do that? Why can't you just write a normal bio? I think It's something that I see a lot of, and I know I don't have an answer, Ben, but I know that it's something that is needed to be talked about. It's very common to lead bios with identity markers, because I don't know, I guess we want people to know who we are, what we've been through, and we're trying to like sort of illustrate that in this like 100-word piece of text to introduce ourselves to people. When it comes to writing about that stuff, I guess the answer is yes. But like I was saying before, it's not that I'm writing about being queer. It's about that being queer informs everything I'm writing about, in a way that someone who isn't queer couldn't write. And I think as queer writers, we can see that in other people's work as well. I was watching Jawbreaker. Do you remember that movie Jawbreaker last night? It's probably the worst example I could bring up, but very, very queer film. Very queer film. No queer characters. I later found out that it was directed by a queer person. So that campness just comes through, and the understanding of the characters' motivations, their stories, everything like that is, you can sort of almost tell it was informed by someone with that lived experience. Although none of those characters are queer in any way whatsoever. I think through queerness, we are not given a standard narrative of what being queer means, and so we have to deconstruct every aspect of our identities and relationships in order to reconstruct them in a way that makes sense to us, because we're not given that roadmap. And I think that really informs the way that we move forward, I guess, if that makes sense.
Great.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jesse. Mark, I saw you nodding along quite enthusiastically to a lot of things that Jesse was saying, and I wonder how much of that resonates with you, because of course, you know, your work at Sweatshop, of course, involves, you know, fostering and editing other people's work as well. You contributed and sub-edited Sweatshop's 2021 anthology Racism that came out earlier this year. Can you kind of reflect on these conversations about authenticity, access, authority, who gets to say what and how it impacts your work? I know this should be like a whole day panel really, but what are the immediate thoughts that come to your mind?
I mean, you know, as someone who works in the television space as well, there's a growing awareness and understanding that if you want to tell a certain story, one of the best things you can do as an ally is to pass the mic. And so while I'm queer, I don't have the range to talk about the trans and non-binary experience. And so I would never want to, you know, encroach that and appropriate that. On a separate note, organizations like Sweatshop truly work to reclaim space in this very sort of white and straight Australian publishing industry. You know, they platform and mentor writers who wouldn't otherwise get an opportunity to be published, you know, namely First Nations people of color from Western Sydney. I was one of many queer writers who contributed to that anthology. And while our primary aim was to showcase that racism does exist in Australia and in many forms, we found that queerness played an organic role in some of these stories, you know, and that the two sit in a sort of Britney Spears crossroads almost. And, you know, I encourage people watching and tuning in to really check out Sweatshop's catalog. There are so much incredible stories, whether they be queer or non-queer. And yeah, and I think your sister, Ben, I think is part of our roster as well, which is really cool.
Absolutely. And, you know, did it take you, I mean, what are those conversations within Sweatshop like? Because, you know, Sweatshop, when it comes to engaging with Western Sydney, is really capturing, I mean, diversity is such a buzzword, but when it comes to Sweatshop's work, it's really capturing a huge diversity of voices. Do you actively and explicitly have conversations with writers coming up through the ranks about, think about these following things, like Laura was saying before? You know, if you're starting to have to go into this kind of work, think about having these following conversations. Are there guidelines as such?
Well, not at all. I think just as I mentioned before, just queerness will come up organically if you're a queer person. You know, it'll show in your writing regardless of whether you put effort into it or not. And I think a really good example is, you know, my piece within Sweatshop. I talk about internalized racism and navigating, you know, the world as someone who's, you know, Filipino Australian and, you know, living in that diaspora. And, you know, my character is also just very clearly gay in this piece. You know, both my culture and my queerness are like inherently intertwined, and I just didn't see it that way as a child. You know, from a broader sense, and when I'm talking about, and you know, Sweatshop is very, very much into, you know, your own individual culture and your roots and your ancestry. So for me, you know, this is something that I only discovered as an adult, but queerness was not an odd concept in pre-colonized Philippines. You know, a lot of tribal folklore talks about this like genderless third, you know, the term called bakla, and it's a term still used today to describe, you know, Filipino queer people. So for me, being gay and being queer is also ancestry. You know, it's a way for me to stay connected to my ancestors and, you know, who watch over me as I cry over boys or like sing Adele in the rain. You know, and I think what Sweatshop does is just really pull out these authentic and genuine and really unique experiences and put it on paper, because sometimes there's a real struggle in doing that, regardless of whether you identify as a writer or not. I've worked with such incredible editors who I may have only met maybe once or twice, but they were able to identify points in my pieces and my writing where they're like, you know, this is such an interesting part, you know, and it's also a very queer part of who you are. Let's pull that out. Let's empower that. Let's strengthen that piece in that. And there's no rules to it. I think it's just, if it's there, it's there. If it's like water being planted, a plant being watered. It's just so beautiful, and I'm so glad to operate in a space like this where my genuine self is celebrated, not just tolerated but celebrated. And so, yeah, I'm really appreciative of organizations like Express Media and Sweatshop for creating these spaces.
That's beautiful, Mark. Thank you so much. Josh, I wonder if what Jesse was saying before resonates with you. You know, this idea that queer framing is the queerness, like even if the work isn't ostensibly queer, you know, it's a perspective and I don't know, maybe even a superpower. It makes me think of your work actually, because, you know, you're really known for columns, polemics, essays, critiques about politics and power, and a lot of those works are about queer issues, but not necessarily, you know, explicitly on the page for some of the work. So to what extent is kind of all of your work informed by a queer framing, and is that kind of like an advantage when it comes to, you know, breaking open arguments and making a point?
Yeah, you know, I think Jesse really hit the nail on the head when he said that I forget the exact way you said it, Jesse, but basically, like, the issue is not that we're queer. The issue is the way the world treats us, and the way that we are forced to interact with normative structures. So, you know, as you kind of indicated, Ben, you know, by virtue of my being queer, all of my writing is queer in a sense, which feels kind of mundane to say, but you know, I think that there's something to that insofar as, you know, being pushed to the outside, you know, to the margins, we might say, of like normative social and political structures, affords us a very good view of power. You know, it's kind of, you know, the fish in water doesn't know it's in water. We are the proverbial fish out of water. You know, we can see exactly what's happening. And, you know, I think one of my mentors in academia, who was, you know, one of my teachers at one point, kind of pointed out that, you know, a lot of philosophers in Australia, for example, tend to come from the country. And I think that in writing, a lot of writers are queer, and I think that there's something going on there in terms of that kind of view from the outside, as you know, it reflects a systematic disadvantage in life, but from an artistic perspective, perhaps gives us a little bit of an advantage.
I want to talk to all of you about this the celebration, but also the kind of restrictiveness of being framed as queer and queer work. So many years ago, I worked for 5 years at a great bookshop in Brisbane called Avid Reader that has a lot of, stocks a lot of queer writing. And one of the things that I was tasked to do as one of the queer booksellers was to start a queer bookshelf, which sounded like a really fun thing to do. And I was really into that idea until I realized how vexed the enterprise even was. Because if there were 2 copies of the book, fantastic, I could shelve it in both literature and queer. But if there was 1 copy of the book, where am I supposed to put this volume of queer poetry? In the queer section or in the poetry section? And as writers, I'd be really keen to hear. What was that, Jesse?
You literally have to pigeonhole the book.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's not even a metaphor anymore. It's a practical exercise. And I'm keen to hear for you as writers, where would you prefer to be on the bookshelf if it does come to a choice, and why? Laura, can I start with you?
Yeah, I remember when, I don't know if this is really relevant, but I remember when I was reviewing the blurb that had been written for Cherry Beach, and I actually wanted it to be more queer. Like I wanted it to be more obvious that this is a book about a lesbian. Like, and I guess like I feel like it's still the case that you kind of have to be one or the other or something. Whereas the more, like, if there were more queer people being given the opportunity to, publish books, and people from the marginalized people publishing books, then you wouldn't, I just feel like maybe there wouldn't have to be these labels. And it just reminds me of when some people who read Cherry before it was published said that I was being very brave by writing a book that had a queer main character, which I just didn't feel like I was being brave. But maybe in a way, if you want to push your book as a queer book, that is still a brave thing, because if it's pigeonholed and it becomes a queer book, then potentially, I don't know, you might not have the same readership. It's just weird. It gets into the whole kind of publicity side of things, and I kind of wanted to push that stuff, but I think I do come from a privileged position where, I don't know, like that. Oh gosh, I don't know. It's hard to talk about it really, but. Yeah.
This is so vexed, right? Like, it's one of those things where it's like, where are you supposed to land with this conversation? Josh, throwing it to you, like, when have labels helped your work, and when have they kind of harmed your work?
Oh, what a question. I'm not embarrassed to call myself a queer writer, and I do call myself a queer writer in my bio, for example, because I fundamentally believe that our lives and our stories are ethically and philosophically interesting. They are worthy. On the other hand, being a queer writer is a hindrance because, many audiences and most mainstream literary institutions do not always agree with me on that point. And so, there is a sense in which queer writing becomes a limitation, a kind of limiting category that marks one as niche and unserious as a writer. And I think that that's really the crux of what eats away at us at night when we're kind of sitting with our egos, is this idea that people will see us as unmeritorious and undeserving, and as kind of glorified fan fiction writers. Side note, nothing wrong with fan fiction, but I think that the point that I would make is that queer writing can be just as profound a literary enterprise as any other kind of writing, And I would really question the assumption that, non-queer writing, so straight or cis writing, is the criterion that we should be using to measure ourselves. Very strange assumption. Are straight writers sitting at straight writers festivals worrying about whether, being a straight writer is, making their writing bad? I don't think they are, and I don't think that we should be doing the same thing. And in terms of where I want to be on that shelf in the literary section or in the queer section, I guess my answer is that I don't really care so long as someone's reading it. But in a more political sense, I don't want to be put into the literary section simply to appeal to non-queers by dequeering my writing. That's not interesting to me. At the same time, I don't want to be put in a queer section to only be read by queers. I think, which is kind of a non-answer, but I guess it's just about rejecting that framework altogether.
Thank you so much, Josh. And thank you so much for foreshadowing our next panel. Is cisgender and straight writing making literature bad? The answer is probably yes. Jesse, you've already touched on a lot of these conversations and issues, but for you, I'm keen to know, when it comes to these conversations and where you've landed, because we're trying to kind of traverse a lot of contradictions about both the power and sometimes the draining of power that labels have. How different is your thinking nowadays to, say, the Jesse of 5 years ago?
Yeah, very interesting. I think it's probably the same. I think to answer the pigeonholing of the book question, it's a trick question. I want my book to be on the front counter, so everyone so it sells, basically. I'm also a bit of an anarchist. I'd probably echo what Josh was saying and label the rest of the library cis straight literature. And then just have, the queer bookshelf. But I don't think it has changed. I think it's it's been a very, and I resonate with what you said, Josh, about being the fish out of water sort of thing, looking in. I think there's no need for us to be separated personally, and I don't think I've ever thought so. I just think it should be easier for me to find, going back to what I said about when I first was looking for the stuff in the bookstore. I don't want to go to the back and then find 3 books in the corner that have been these are queer books for queer people. That's why I love Hares and Hyenas. You can go in there and just explore and just pick things up, and then it's no longer about being queer or non-queer. It's just about, do I like this book or not? I think more bookstores should be like that, and I think that's probably one of the biggest criticisms of the literature industry as a whole when it comes to diversity is every bookstore should be like that. You should go in and find everything under the sun from every type of person easily, and then it becomes about the stories, and it becomes about the connection with those narratives rather than the type of narrative, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jesse. And excellent of you to bring up Hares and Hyenas. Big shout out to Hares and Hyenas and the bookshop Darlinghurst and queer owned and queer bookshops who have been doing it tough this year. So now that lockdowns are starting to recede, go out there and support those bookshops in person or online. Mark, what about you? There are so many different ways to label ourselves in ways that are helpful to us and ways that are harmful to us. When it comes to your work, what do you prefer and how have you landed there?
Yeah, well, I can really only talk from, I've come from Western Sydney, which was a majority no region of Sydney, and it's home to a lot of cultures that lean conservative. And so there's a real element of danger to navigating my hometown and my community as an outwardly queer writer or someone who labels themselves as a queer writer. I'm very grateful and lucky, though, to be surrounded by fellow queer people and allies where I live. So having that support system really empowers and safeguards my work. that and aesthetically, I very proudly look like a club bouncer, so I'm covered. I can never, there's no, I'm fine. But I think for your question and for this bookshelf question, for me, it comes down to my ethos as a writer. And I think for everyone, it'll come down to their purpose as a writer. And for me, I write because I needed that when I was younger. I was one of two out kids at my school. I needed that visibility. And so for me right now, I'm doing the work for future generations to build that safe space and that comfortability. And then just in relation to the shelf, I think it'd be great to sit in the queer section, but I think it'd be great to open a queer bookstore in Western Sydney. We don't have a Newtown strip of bookstores. We have Kmart and QPD, and that's it. And so yeah, for me as someone from Western Sydney, I'd love to start opening those spaces or being open to those spaces, and maybe becoming a little bit more metropolitan, but in a way that's us and in a way that's ours. And so yeah, I think that's where I stand.
Thank you, Mark. Let's take those QBD bookshops and turn the Q into queer. Let's refranchise them. Hey, folks, I'm really, really keen to hear your recommendations. We started off this session by talking about the stuff that you were reading growing up that had a really big impact on you in different ways, but I'm keen to hear about the stuff that you're reading, or maybe even not just reading, but consuming, especially in Australia, but also beyond, that you think are like really, really great texts, queer texts that you just want to put into someone else's hands with enthusiasm and excitement right now. So let's do a bit of a book club blitz. Laura, what's exciting you at the moment when it comes to queer writing and work here and beyond?
Yeah, well, a book that I think it came out last year, but it's won or been shortlisted for quite a few awards, Revenge by S.L. Lim. I don't know if anyone's read or heard of. It's just the most incredible
it was a book that was
yeah.
shortlisted for the Stella, is that right?
Yeah. And I've never read anything like it. I didn't know what it was going to be when I picked it up. It's sort of almost been publicized as a sort of thriller or a murder crime novel, but it's not really. It's about a woman growing up who's queer, and she has this really complicated relationship with her brother, who I think has, narcissistic personality disorder. But yeah, it's just it's the way it's written is like nothing I've ever read. It's so it's just so emotive and dark, and there's queer sex of women loving women sex that's just really sexy and obsessive, and a lot of this sex happens when she's a middle-aged woman, which is whatever, but it's just cool. It's just really, I loved it, and I love that it's winning awards or being shortlisted for awards. Another book that I loved that I read a couple of years ago that has a queer kind of, the main character is a lesbian, but it's not, the book isn't about that at all, which I just love that. Is called America Is Not the Heart by Elaine Castillo. She's a Filipino-American writer. It's just a beautiful book, and again, really beautiful sex scenes between the women that just felt really personal, and I'd highly recommend that book as well. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura. So those were America Is Not the Heart by Elaine Castillo and Revenge by S.L. Lim. I'm going to throw it to Joshua now. What's really floating your boat when it comes to queer work in Australia and beyond? What do you really want to recommend to other people?
Yeah, this was, the first person that came to mind was Alison Whittaker. It's the kind of writing, and I don't know if this is just me being a jealous person, but, as a writer, when you're reading someone and you're like, fuck, I'm just so mad that I didn't write this. Like, this is so good. Reading her essays and just, I think she's really good. I want to say that she's a shady writer, but she's really good at just like very understated but devastating prose that is just like absolutely delicious. And I think that a lot of the I kind of resent this because I want to be really anti-imperial about it, but a lot of the writing that I've loved the most from the last few years has come out of the North Americas. Alexander Chee, Ocean Vuong, and most recently Billy Ray Belcourt, I think, are just writing phenomenal stuff, both, on the level of craft, like Chee's prose is just like something else altogether. As well as what they're writing about and the way that they write about both queer and non-queer issues and the seriousness with which they treat their experiences, and also the way that all of it is directed towards a kind of utopian vision of the future that's better than now. Just absolutely delicious stuff. Cannot recommend those writers enough.
I'd back up a lot of those recommendations, Joshua. Thank you so much. Jesse, what about you, within the realm of poetry or prose or anything else that you're consuming at the moment? What's really exciting you?
Yeah, while everyone was talking, I was like thinking of what my answer would be. Because I'm like, do I go down the fiction route of what I've been like reading, or do I advocate for spoken word? I think I'm going to advocate for spoken word.
Why don't you do all of it? Why don't you do all of it?
Fiction, I just finished Holden Shepherd's Invisible Boys, which is from my home side of the country, which was really a good read. Like, really couldn't put it down, just read it through basically. I think it was like, yeah, good characters, and I guess that representation and familiarity with my home sort of town that I needed when I was younger. So that's the sort of feeling I got from it. Spoken word, I wanted to mention a couple of poets because I think spoken word and slam poetry is intrinsically tied to identity, because it's a very personal non-fiction form of expression. And so the sort of stuff that comes out of it, I think, is compulsory reading, we can call it. Andy Stewart, Ariel Cottingham, and some niche ones from, again, back home in Perth. Little poetry spoken word community over there is something that really nurtured me into the lit world. So Saoirse Nash and Jacob Boyd, you can find all of that online if you just search their names, and then they've got performances that you can watch. So yeah.
Beautiful stuff. Thank you so much, Jesse. And finally, Mark, what's getting you excited right now?
Well, so in terms of queer books, there's this author in the States. His name's Adam Silvera, and he wrote a thread of books. Some of my favorite have been They Both Die at the End, Heartbreak Is All You Left Me, and they're very queer-centric stories, and they're queer brown stories as well. I'm a really big fan of Omar Sakar. He's an Australian author and poet. His latest book, The Lost Arabs, was such an incredible read. In the visual space, I'm really loving this resurgence of like boy love dramas on YouTube and, across, streaming services. I think one of the most prominent being Game Boys from the Philippines. So repping that as much as I can. And then there is this one author, you may not have heard of him. His name's Benjamin Law. And he wrote The Family Law. And, that did so much for the gay Asian community here in Australia. So I'm so grateful for these texts, and it's doing the work, and I'm so grateful.
Thank you, Mark. That's very kind. I'm blushing in places that are not usually exposed to daylight. That's very, very lovely of you. Thank you. Hey, we've almost run out of time, everyone. But just before we go, it strikes me that it's such an interesting time in this continent we now call Australia, that a lot of us, especially in the East Coast, have had a really, really tough year of being isolated, and often writing is isolation. And this year's probably compounded those feelings. But the queer writing community is a really strong one. And I imagine all of you are looking forward to reconnecting with your communities in different ways. There'll be a lot of people who are watching who haven't quite found their community yet. So just before we go, I'm keen to hear if you have any advice for them to find their writing community, their queer community, and maybe stuff that you wish you knew when you were finding out your community. Can I start with you, Jesse?
Yeah, again, the spoken word community has been like probably one of the most diverse pockets I've ever experienced. And I think that's just because by the very nature of the art form, people are sharing their stories and people are listening. So it would not exist unless it was an accepting and welcoming space. That really fed into, the wider literary community, and, less the case, unfortunately, but there's still those pockets there that are really supportive and welcoming. Express media is one of them, and that's why I love my job so much. But I think you can find there's a lot more of them now than there used to be. So, and it's only getting better.
Thanks so much, Jesse. What about you, Joshua? Where have you found community? Where might others find theirs?
I was actually thinking about this one, and for me, I kind of, foreshadowed earlier that I had quite a lonely childhood, and that really followed me into and even past my undergrad. And so I finished my writing degree without actually having made a lot of, writerly or literary friends. And I think this might be a really queer answer, but I think that I met most of my writing community on the dance floor. So not necessarily through, writing venues as such, but just by being in the world and being with others, and then kind of discovering after the fact that we actually share a craft, and how great is that? That being said, go to the festival, go to the slam, go to the book club, just it's just, everyone is kind of like freewheeling atoms just kind of floating around, and you just want to try to collide with other people in the nicest way possible as often as possible. So whatever it is, dance floor, festival, just, go out.
Yeah, I'm so glad that we get that opportunity to be with each other, colliding with each other, safely and vaccinated if you can, people. Mark, what about you? Where are you finding community? Where might other people find theirs?
I mean, I think you need a sort of dual approach to this. I think on one side, you have to be really formulaic, do your research, search through Google, type in the niches and the subjects and the things you want to talk about and want to talk to other people about. And then on the flip side, I'm also a really big believer in trusting in the divine. For me, Sweatshop came at such a pinnacle time in my life, where I was just like looking for what I wanted to write about and the audiences I wanted to write for. And it just came out of the blue. They existed this whole time, and they would have come up if I typed in Western Sydney writing spaces. But then it came to me in a different way. So yeah, I'm not saying, throw yourself into CoStar or, go to a psychic or anything, but I think trust that there's certain universal timings out there, and you'll find your community and the perfect community in time. And yeah.
Thanks, Mark. And I'll leave the last word to you, Laura. Where did you find your sense of community, and where might other people find theirs?
Yeah, well, I'd say Twitter. Twitter was a big way that I met a lot of people in the writing community, first online and then in person. You have to put yourself out there and DM people a bit, and just ask if you want to have a coffee or, But when I was living in Toronto, where I lived for a couple of years, I really wanted to get to know writers there. So I asked a number of people I didn't know who were writers, would you like to join a writing group? And they said yes. And then we met at a cafe every week and wrote together and chatted, and it was amazing. Like I'm still friends with a lot of those people, and I did it again when I got back to Melbourne, and I've met some of my closest friends who are writers through that. It was just the coolest thing. So you basically meet up and write together, chat a little bit, and then create kind of connections running off that with the people that you connect with the most. So I'd highly encourage people to do that if you can. Yeah.
I love that. Thank you so much, Laura. You're really making me itchy to get out of quarantine, all of you, actually. But I really appreciate that advice, and I know a lot of people watching will be. Thank you so much to all of our panelists today, Laura McPhee-Browne, Jesse Oliver, Mark Mariano, and Joshua Badge. We're really, really thrilled that you could join us here for the EnQueer Festival. You can find EnQueer online on Instagram at EnQueer_Sydney, and find out more information about the festival, enqueer.com.au. I've been Benjamin Law. Happy reading, happy queer reading.